There are stories that historians walk up to and then quietly set back down, not because the evidence is thin, not because the record is incomplete, but because the story, when you read it carefully, resists every framework a rational mind tries to place around it. The case of Silas and Harlan Vance of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, is one of those stories. It has been sitting in the county archives since 1887. It has been sitting there, largely untouched, because the people who found it first decided it was easier not to look at it too hard. This account will look at it hard. Before we begin, drop in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. Because what happened to the Vance brothers happened in a place that looked, by every outward measure, like anywhere else in the Appalachian highlands. That is the part of this story that matters most. Silas Vance was 34 years old in the spring of 1883. His younger brother Harlan was 29. They had been born and raised on a family property at the far end of a narrow hollow in the eastern section of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, a stretch of land their father had cleared in the 1840s, and their grandfather had first walked in the decade before that. The property consisted of 61 acres of mixed hardwood and cleared farmland, a main house built from chestnut timber, a barn, 2 outbuildings, and a spring house positioned above a creek that ran cold even in summer. By 1883, both parents were dead. The brothers had no surviving siblings. They had no wives. They lived on that property together as they always had, running a small cattle operation and cutting timber in the seasons when the weather permitted. Silas was the older and, by all accounts, the quieter of the two. A man named Irvin Crouch, who bought timber from the Vance brothers on several occasions in the early 1880s, described Silas in a statement later given to Greenbrier County authorities as a lean, deliberate man with calloused hands and dark eyes the color of the creek in shadow, a man who spoke when he had something to say and was otherwise content to let the world pass in silence. He was known as a careful worker and an honest dealer. Nobody in that part of the county had a complaint against him. Harlan was different, not troublingly so, not in the way that would later seem obvious in retrospect, but different enough that people noticed. He laughed more readily than his brother. He was quicker to speak and quicker to anger, though the anger never lasted. He was described by more than one neighbor as a man who seemed, at times, to be listening to something that other people could not hear. Nobody attached much significance to this observation when they first made it. Mountain people understood that long winters and deep isolation produced their own kind of inwardness. Harlan Vance's inwardness had a quality to it, but nobody had a language for the quality at the time. The spring of 1883 was the first spring in anyone's memory in that part of Greenbrier County that the creek behind the Vance property ran red, not consistently, not all at once, but beginning in the first week of April. In the mornings after hard overnight rains, the water coming out of the spring house had a discoloration that one neighbor, a woman named Della Pritt, whose property was a mile and a half downstream, described in a statement recorded by the county clerk in September 1883 as the color of rust, with a smell she could not name except to say it was heavy and wrong. She assumed an animal had died upstream. She let it pass. Silas and Harlan Vance were seen in the settlement of Rennick, the nearest crossroads community, in late March of 1883, the last confirmed sighting of both brothers together by anyone outside their property. A storekeeper named Walter Neal recorded the visit in his ledger, noting that Silas purchased salt, flour, and a quantity of lamp oil, and that Harlan purchased nothing, but stood near the door the entire time, facing outward, as though watching for something on the road. Neal noted that Silas paid and left quickly. He noted that neither brother spoke more than was necessary. He noted, in an afterthought at the bottom of the entry, that Harlan had looked at him once during the visit, directly, without expression, in a way that Neal wrote he would prefer not to describe in detail and did not. It was not until June of 1883 that anyone had a reason to go to the Vance property directly. The reason was business. Irvin Crouch had arranged with Silas Vance in a conversation the previous autumn to purchase a load of cut timber in the early summer. When no word came from the Vance property as the agreed date approached, Crouch sent a message by a boy he employed, asking whether the timber was ready. The boy returned and said he had gone to the property and knocked at the door of the main house and received no answer. He said the door had been closed. He said the cattle were present in the field. He said he had not gone past the gate. Crouch waited another 2 weeks. Then he went himself. What Irvin Crouch found when he arrived at the Vance property in the third week of June 1883 was the subject of a sworn statement he gave to Sheriff Ambrose Dunmore of Greenbrier County on June 24th of that year. The statement is preserved in the Greenbrier County Circuit Court historical files in Lewisburg, West Virginia. It is 7 pages in length. The first 4 pages describe the property as Crouch approached it. The cattle still present, the fields untended but not catastrophically so. the house outwardly intact. The fifth page describes what he found at the door of the main house. The sixth and seventh pages are a different kind of document entirely. They are the pages of a man trying to find words for something that did not fit inside the words he had. Crouch wrote that the door of the main house was unlocked. He wrote that when he opened it, the smell that came out was unlike anything he had encountered before, and he was a man who had worked in rough conditions his entire life. He wrote that he stood in the doorway for a long time before he could make himself go in. He wrote that the interior of the house was in a state of significant disorder, not as if it had been ransacked, but as if whatever had happened inside had happened over time progressively in stages. He wrote that he found Harlan Vance in the back room of the house, alive, seated on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees drawn to his chest, and that Harlan was conscious but unresponsive to anything Crouch said or did for the first several minutes. He wrote that Harlan's hands were badly damaged. He used the word damaged and did not elaborate. He wrote that Harlan looked at him eventually, and that the look on Harlan Vance's face was not the look of a man in a house. It was, as Crouch wrote, the look of a man who had traveled somewhere and had not entirely returned. Silas Vance was not in the house. Sheriff Ambrose Dunmore arrived at the Vance property on June 25, 1883, with his deputy, a man named Curtis Alderman. Dunmore was a former schoolteacher who had served as Greenbrier County Sheriff for 9 years. He was methodical, literate, and skeptical by training and temperament. His case notes from the Vance investigation, handwritten in a brown ledger that is now part of the Greenbrier County Historical Society collection in Lewisburg, reflect the thinking of a man who was committed to finding an ordinary explanation and increasingly unable to find one. Dunmore's first priority was Harlan Vance, who had been transported to a physician in Renwick. The physician, a man named Dr. Osius Falk, examined Harlan and filed a written report with the county court. The report notes that Harlan was physically weakened, dehydrated, and that his hands showed evidence of injuries consistent with, in Falk's precise language, prolonged exposure to cold and pressure, as though they had been held submerged or confined for an extended period. Falk noted that Harlan was capable of speech but spoke very little, and that what he said when he did speak was not always coherent as response to what he had been asked. Falk recorded 3 of Harlan's statements verbatim in his report. The first, "Silas went down to look." The second, "The creek asked for it." The third, delivered after a long silence when Falk asked him where his brother was. "He is still down there. He will not come back up." Dunmore's search of the Vance property over the following 3 days found no sign of Silas Vance. The creek was examined along its full length through the property. A section of the bank near the spring house showed evidence of recent disturbance, soil displaced, vegetation pressed down, but the creek itself revealed nothing. Dunmore noted in his case ledger that the water in that section ran with a discoloration he described as brownish, with a quality he was reluctant to attribute to any specific cause. He noted that his deputy refused to wade into the water past a certain point and that he did not press the matter. Inside the spring house, Dunmore found details he recorded in his ledger with care and without interpretation. The walls of the structure, which had been built from flat limestone set without mortar, had markings on them that he could not account for, not carvings. He was clear on this distinction, but pressings as though something had been held repeatedly against the stone at a height consistent with a standing man's shoulder or face. The limestone in those areas was darkened and worn smooth in a way that he estimated would require years of repeated contact. He noted that the spring house had been on the Vance property for at least 30 years, possibly longer. He noted that neither Silas nor Harlan had ever mentioned the spring house in any context that suggested it was anything other than a functional outbuilding. He did not speculate in the official record about what the marks meant. In the personal ledger at the bottom of the entry, he wrote 3 words: "Something waited there." The search extended over the following week to the surrounding timber and hillside. Nothing was found. Silas Vance, 34 years old, a man known to every neighbor in that hollow, a man with no history of wandering or instability, had simply ceased to be present in the world. Harlan Vance recovered physically over the summer of 1883. The recovery took longer than Dr. Falk had initially expected. The injuries to his hands healed but slowly, and Falk noted in a follow-up record filed in August that Harlan consistently refused to keep his hands bandaged, saying only that the wrapping felt wrong. Falk noted this without medical comment. He noted it because it struck him as the kind of detail a careful record should contain even when the meaning of it was unclear. Harlan was never again entirely well in the way that people meant when they used the word well. He returned to the property in August because he had nowhere else to go, and he lived there alone. He did not cut timber. He did not sell cattle. He did not come to Renwick more than was absolutely necessary. People who saw him in those months described him consistently as a man who had been hollowed out and refilled with something quieter and heavier than what had been there before. Sheriff Dunmore visited the property twice more that autumn. He was trying to close an open record, a missing persons inquiry, and he needed Harlan's account of what had happened. In his case ledger, Dunmore recorded these visits in full. Harlan spoke to him on both occasions. What he said was consistent between the two visits, which Dunmore noted was itself unusual, because people constructing a false account tend to introduce variations. What Harlan said, reduced to its essential elements, was this: that beginning in early April, something had changed in the sound of the creek at night, that Silas had heard it first and begun spending long hours at the spring house listening, that by May Silas had stopped sleeping in the house, that in the second week of June, Silas had told Harlan that the creek had been asking for something, and that he understood now what it was, that Silas had walked to the spring house in the early morning and had not come back, that Harlan had gone to look and had found nothing, and had put his hands in the water to search in the dark beneath the bank and had understood, immediately, in a way he could not explain, that Silas was gone in a direction that could not be followed. Dunmore recorded his own assessment of this account in a private notation at the bottom of the final entry. H. Vance is not a man who fabricates. He is not a man given to fancy. What he has described is not an explanation. It is the outline of an experience that has no explanation available to me. I am closing this inquiry as an unresolved disappearance. I am not satisfied with this outcome. I do not expect to become satisfied. The investigation was formally closed in November of 1883. The cause of Silas Vance's disappearance was listed as unknown. No criminal proceedings were pursued. No body was ever recovered. Harlan Vance lived on the family property for another 4 years. He was found dead in the spring house in October of 1887 by the same Irvin Crouch who had found him in 1883. The county physician who examined the body concluded that Harlan had died of natural causes, heart failure, in a man who had been in declining health for some time. He was 33 years old. There was nothing wrong with the examination. There was nothing medically suspicious about the finding, except for one detail that Crouch included in his account of the discovery, and that the physician chose not to include in the official report because it had no medical bearing on the cause of death. Crouch noted that when he found Harlan in the spring house, Harlan's hands were submerged to the wrist in the water of the spring. He noted that the expression on Harlan's face was not the expression of a man who had died in pain or distress. He noted it was the most at peace he had ever seen a human face look. He noted that the water around the hands was very still, even though the spring always ran moving. Today, the hollow in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, where the Vance property stood, is overgrown to the degree that the land is almost unrecognizable as having ever been cleared. The main house is gone. The last recorded reference to the structure standing is in a property survey from 1901. The springhouse foundation is still visible in the right season. The vegetation pulls back enough to expose the stone. The creek still runs through the property. It runs clear in most conditions. Local people in that part of Greenbrier County do not have a story attached to that particular hollow the way they have stories attached to other places. That is, in its own way, the most unsettling detail of this entire account. Most places with histories become places with reputations. This one simply became a place where nobody goes. The Greenbrier County case file for Silas Vance is 11 pages. It answers nothing. It documents, with the careful precision of a man who wanted the record to be accurate, the shape of something that could not be explained. Dunmore lived until 1911. In his later years, according to his daughter's memoir, published privately in 1934 and held in the West Virginia State Archives, he spoke about the Vance case only once. He said that in his career he had seen violence, accident, cruelty, and the full range of things that human beings do to themselves and each other. He said none of it had stayed with him the way the Vance case stayed with him. He said the reason was not the mystery of the disappearance. He said the reason was Harlan's face, the expression on it, the certainty in it, the way a man who had watched his brother walk into something incomprehensible and vanish had looked by the end of his own life, as though he understood what it was and was no longer afraid of it. Some things in the Appalachian Mountains are not violence and are not accident, and are not the product of human failure. Some things are older than the explanations we have built to contain them. The Vance brothers did not encounter evil in that hollow. What they encountered was something for which the word evil is the wrong shape entirely. Here is the question this story leaves behind. Harlan Vance spent 4 years alone on that property after his brother disappeared. He knew what the creek had taken. He knew what it had asked for. And at the end of those 4 years, he went to the spring house and he put his hands in the water and he waited. Was that a man who lost his mind to grief? Or was that a man who made a decision, clear-eyed, deliberate, entirely his own, to follow his brother wherever the water went? Drop that in the comments. I want to know where you stand on it. If these stories from the forgotten edges of the mountains, the ones that the official record closes without answers, are the kind that stay with you, subscribe and ring the bell. We are not running out of hollows. We are not running out of stories. The mountains have been keeping them a long time. The water still runs there, cold even in summer, and very still when it shouldn't be.